Elena wakes up in a hospital with temporary amnesia after a devastating car accident. To her shock, she discovers that she is pregnant, but she has no memory of who the baby's father is. The only person who comes to claim her is Dante Moretti, the cold and powerful boss of a Sicilian mafia family. He introduces himself as her fiancé, insisting that she belongs with him. You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Romance channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. The first thing Elena Ricci noticed was the smell. Antiseptic, sharp and clinical, cutting through the fog that clung to her mind like wet wool. The second thing was the sound, a steady, rhythmic beeping that she didn't recognize as her own heartbeat until she tried to move and the sound sped up in alarm. White ceiling, fluorescent light dimmed to a merciful grey. An IV line taped into the back of her hand. She blinked, and blinking hurt, as if her eyelids had forgotten how to perform such a simple task without consulting the rest of her broken body first. "You're awake." A woman in blue scrubs appeared at her bedside, her voice gentle but professional, the voice of someone who delivered difficult truths for a living. "Eleanor, can you hear me?" Eleanor. The name landed strangely, like a word in a language she'd only half learned. She tested it silently. Eleanor, 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 and found no memory attached to it. No childhood echo of someone calling her in for dinner, no lover whispering it into a pillow. Just a sound, just letters. Where? Her throat was sandpaper. Where am I? St. Agnes Medical Centre. You were in a car accident 4 days ago. The nurse checked something on a monitor, not quite meeting her eyes, which made the unease in Eleanor's chest sharpen into something colder. You've been unconscious. There was some swelling on your brain, but the scans are clean now. Do you know what year it is? Eleanor opened her mouth to answer and found the number gone, slipped through her fingers like water. She knew abstractly that years existed, that time moved forward in a line, but which one she currently stood on eluded her completely. I don't... Panic began to claw up her throat. I don't know. I don't know what year it is. I don't know my last name. I don't know anything. That's all right. That's expected given the trauma. It's called retrograde amnesia. It's often temporary. The nurse's hand found her shoulder, warm and steadying. Your memories should return in pieces, over time. Try not to force it. Just breathe. Elena breathed. It was the only instruction she could actually follow. It was then, in the stillness after the nurse left to fetch the doctor, that Elena's hand, moving without her permission, guided by some animal instinct she didn't understand, drifted down to rest against her stomach, and stopped, and pressed, gently, testing. There was a curve there, small but undeniable, a swell beneath the thin hospital gown that did not belong to the woman she remembered being, except she remembered being no one at all, so how would she know? The doctor who came next was younger than she expected, with tired eyes and a clipboard he held like a shield. "Miss Ricci, you're 11 weeks pregnant," he said, gently but without preamble, as if he'd learned the hard way that softening such news only made the shock last longer. "The fetus is stable. No injuries from the accident affected the pregnancy. But given your memory loss, I understand this may come as... I don't know whose it is." The words fell out of her, flat and stunned. I don't know who the father is. I don't know if I have a husband, a boyfriend, anyone. I don't know anything about my own life, and there's a person growing inside me, and I don't know their father's name." The doctor's face did something complicated. Pity, professional discomfort, the particular helplessness of a man trained to fix bodies being asked to fix a soul instead. "There is someone," he said carefully. "A man has been coming to the hospital every day since the accident. Security had to remove him twice from the ICU before you were stable enough for visitors. He says he's your fiancé." Something in Elena's chest went very still, the way the air stills before a storm breaks. "What's his name?" "Dante Moretti." The name meant nothing to her, and everything, somehow, in the way it seemed to vibrate faintly in the empty rooms of her mind, like a bell rung in a house she couldn't remember living in. "Is he here now?" The doctor's expression shifted again, something wary this time, something that made Elena, despite knowing nothing else about her life, understand instinctively that whoever Dante Moretti was, he was not an ordinary man. "He's in the waiting room. He's been there for 6 hours. The doctor hesitated. "Miss Ritchie, I have to ask you directly. Do you want to see him? You're not obligated to. Given the memory loss, we can restrict visitors if—" "No." The word came out before she'd decided to say it, propelled by something underneath conscious thought. Curiosity, perhaps, or the desperate hunger of a woman drowning in blankness who would grasp at any hand offered to her, even a stranger's. Even a dangerous stranger's. "I want to see him. I want to know who he is. I want to know who I am." The doctor nodded slowly, made a note, and left her alone with the beeping machines and the small, secret weight low in her belly. The only proof she had that somewhere, in the erased country of her own life, she had loved someone. Or been used by someone. She had no way yet to know which. 10 minutes later, the door opened and the air in the room changed. He filled the doorway before he even stepped through it. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in a black suit so precisely tailored it looked less like clothing and more like armour. His hair was dark, cropped close at the sides, and his jaw carried 2 days of stubble that did nothing to soften the sharp architecture of his face. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. Grey, almost silver, and utterly, devastatingly still. The eyes of a man who had trained himself long ago never to let anyone see what moved beneath the surface. He stopped 3 feet from the bed, as if some invisible line prevented him from crossing further, and Elena watched something flicker behind that stillness. Relief, maybe, or grief, or both, wrestled down almost before it surfaced. Elena. Her name in his mouth sounded different than in the nurse's. Heavier, older, like he'd said it 10,000 times before in 10,000 different rooms. "You're awake." "You're Dante." Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "They said you're my fiancé." Something crossed his face. She would learn, much later, that it was the particular pain of a man being asked to confirm a lie he'd told out of desperation, watching it become truth in real time, whether he wanted it to or not. But in that moment, she only saw his jaw tighten, his hands curl faintly at his sides. "Yes," he said. 4 months. I proposed in April." "I don't remember it." The confession cost her something to say, some pride she didn't know she had until it bent. "I don't remember you at all." "I don't remember anything before I woke up here." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her the way a man might study a painting he owned that had been badly damaged in a fire, assessing what remained, what could be restored, what was lost for good. Then he pulled the single chair in the room close to her bed and sat, close enough that she could smell him, cedar and something darker underneath, like the inside of an old library, like money that had aged into power. "Then I'll tell you what you need to know," he said. "You're Elena Ricci, 26. You worked as an architect before the accident. You designed the renovation on the De Silva building downtown, if that means anything to you." It didn't. She shook her head, and something tightened around his eyes. "We met a year and a half ago. I asked you to marry me in April. You said yes." A pause. "You're carrying my child." Elena's hand moved instinctively back to her stomach, as if to shield it, or perhaps to confirm the truth of what he'd just said against the only physical evidence she had. "Prove it," she said, before she could stop herself. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to be cruel. I woke up in a hospital not knowing my own name, and a man I've never seen tells me I'm engaged to him and pregnant with his child, and I have absolutely no way to know if any of it is true. You could be anyone. You could be lying." For the first time, something like the ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, not warm exactly, but appreciative, the way a man might admire an opponent's unexpected move on a chessboard. "Smart," he said quietly. "You were always smart. It's one of the things that made me—" He stopped himself, recalibrated. He reached into his jacket and produced his phone, scrolling, then turned the screen toward her. A photograph. Elena, in a green dress, laughing at something off camera, her hand resting on the forearm of the very man now sitting beside her hospital bed, his own expression, she noted with a strange jolt, softer in the photo than it had been at any point since he'd entered the room. Behind them, floor-to-ceiling windows framed a city skyline at night. "There are hundreds more," he said. "Videos. A ring, if you want to see it. It's in my safe. I didn't want it stolen while you were unconscious. Witnesses. My staff. Your friend Marissa, though she's travelling and hasn't been able to visit yet." His grey eyes held hers unblinking. "I'm not lying to you, Elena. I know this is a nightmare for you, waking up in a body that carries a life you don't remember creating, engaged to a man whose face means nothing to you. But I promise you, every word I've said is true." It wasn't every word, not even close, but Elena, drowning in the blank white nothing of her own erased history, had no way to know that yet, and Dante Moretti, cold, calculating, a man who had buried 3 men with his own hands and never lost a night's sleep over it, found that for the first time in longer than he could remember, lying to someone felt less like a strategy and more like something being carved slowly out of his chest. "Okay," Elena said finally, exhaustion pulling at her voice. "Okay. I believe you." She didn't see the flicker of something like shame cross his face before he mastered it. She only felt his hand, warm and careful, cover hers where it rested against the blanket. And despite knowing nothing about him, despite every rational instinct that should have recoiled from a stranger's touch, some deeper current in her responded to it, like a plant turning toward light it had forgotten the name of, but remembered somehow to need. Dante's penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower overlooking the harbour, and when the private elevator opened directly into the foyer, Elena understood immediately that whatever life she'd forgotten, it had not been a small one. Marble floors, veined in grey and gold, stretched toward a living room with windows that turned the entire western wall into a single sheet of glass. The city sprawled beneath like a field of scattered light. A woman in her 50s, introduced simply as Carmela, the housekeeper, hovered nearby with the particular anxiety of someone unused to seeing her employer look uncertain about anything. "Your room is this way," Dante said, gesturing down a hallway with more restraint than Elena expected from a man who apparently owned all of this. "I've had Carmela move some of your things in from the room you'd been using before the accident. If anything feels wrong, we can change it." "Before the accident, I had a different room?" Elena asked, following him, cataloguing details with the desperate attention of someone trying to reconstruct a self from scattered artifacts. We didn't share a room?" Something crossed his jaw. "We were taking things slowly," he said, which felt, even to Elena's memoryless ear, like a door closing rather than opening. "You wanted your own space. I respected that." The room he led her to was beautiful. Soft cream walls, a bed dressed in linen the colour of morning fog, a small writing desk by the window stacked with sketchbooks that, when she opened one with trembling fingers, revealed page after page of architectural drawings in her own handwriting. Bridges, facades, a church renovation with delicate notes in the margins about light and shadow. "This is mine," she whispered, running her thumb over the ink. "I made these." "You're brilliant," Dante said, and for the first time his voice lost some of its careful control. "You used to talk about buildings the way other people talk about music. I used to—" He stopped. "You used to what?" "I used to just listen," he said. "I don't talk much. You didn't seem to mind." Elena studied him, this cold, contained man who owned an empire's worth of glass and marble, who apparently loved a woman enough to memorize the way she spoke about facades and light, and yet flinched subtly every time she asked him a direct question about their past. It didn't add up cleanly, and some sharp, undamaged part of her mind, the part that had once, apparently, calculated load-bearing walls and structural integrity for a living, filed the inconsistency away. "Dante." She sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed that was somehow hers. "Why does everyone here look at you like they're afraid of you?" The question landed exactly where she'd aimed it. She watched him consider several answers before settling, apparently, on the truth, or something close to it. "Because I run a family business," he said, "a large one. Real estate, shipping, imports. It's made me powerful, and powerful men make people nervous, especially the ones who work for them." He held her gaze, testing whether she'd push further. "Does that frighten you?" "I don't know what to be frightened of," Elena said honestly. "I don't know anything. I'm trusting you because I have no other choice, not because I've decided you're safe." Something flashed behind his eyes, not anger, she realized with surprise, but a kind of aching respect, as if her wariness was, perversely, one more piece of evidence that the woman he remembered was still somewhere inside this stranger's body. "That's fair," he said quietly. "I won't ask you to trust me blindly. I'll ask you to give me time to earn it back." Back. As if it had existed once and simply misplaced itself like a set of keys. Elena wanted to ask what, exactly, she was earning trust back toward. What version of trust had existed between them before the accident stole it clean out of her skull? But exhaustion was pulling at her again, her body's demand for rest overriding her mind's hunger for answers. "I need to sleep," she said instead. "Of course." He stood, moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't yet read, but would come to recognize over the following weeks as the particular hunger of a man who had convinced himself he didn't deserve the thing he wanted most, and was choosing, against every instinct of self-preservation, to want it anyway. "Elena," he said, "whatever you remember or don't remember, I'm glad you're alive. I need you to know that, even if nothing else makes sense right now." Then he was gone, and Elena lay in the unfamiliar bed, in the unfamiliar penthouse, one hand resting against the small, undeniable curve of her stomach, wondering what kind of man built an empire cold enough to frighten his own household staff, and warm enough to make a stranger's heart, her heart apparently, in some life she couldn't recall, decide to love him anyway. The dreams began on the fourth night. Not memories exactly. The doctor had warned her it might work this way, that trauma-locked recollection often surfaced first as feeling before image, sensation before narrative. But Elena woke gasping at 3 a.m. with the ghost sense of rain on a windshield, headlights refracting through water, a voice shouting her name from very far away. Dante's voice. She was almost sure of it. She didn't tell him about the dream. Instead, she wandered the penthouse in the dark, drawn by some instinct toward the study she hadn't yet been inside, and found the door unlocked, and found Dante himself sitting behind a heavy oak desk, a single lamp burning, a glass of something amber untouched at his elbow. He looked up sharply when she entered, and for one unguarded second, before he could arrange his face into its usual stillness, she saw something raw and exhausted there, the face of a man who hadn't slept properly since the crash, who carried some weight she couldn't name. "Couldn't sleep," she said, by way of explanation, wrapping her robe tighter. "Neither could I." He gestured at the chair across from him, and she took it, curious despite herself about this room. Bookshelves lined with what looked like ledgers rather than novels, a wall safe half hidden behind a painting of the Sicilian coastline, a framed photograph of an older man with Dante's same grey eyes standing beside a much younger Dante on what looked like a vineyard. "Your father?" she asked, nodding at the photo. "My father. He died 6 years ago." Dante's voice went carefully flat, in the way she was learning meant the subject cost him something. "He built the family business. I inherited it younger than I should have." "What was he like?" "Ruthless." A pause. "And loving, in his way." "Both things can be true of the same man. You'll find that out about most of the men in my world, if you stay in it long enough." If you stay in it. The phrase snagged in her mind. Do I have a choice? Staying in it, I mean. Dante set down his pen. For a long moment he simply looked at her, and she had the strange sensation of being weighed on some invisible scale, of watching a man decide in real time how much honesty he could afford to spend. "You always had a choice," he said finally. "You still do. I would never force you to stay somewhere you didn't want to be, Elena. Not even here. Not even with me." That's a strange thing for a fiancé to say. Maybe. His jaw tightened. But it's true. She studied his hands, resting flat on the desk. Strong hands, a faded white scar crossing two knuckles, no wedding ring, but a single black signet ring on his right hand, bearing a crest she didn't recognize, three interlocking shapes she couldn't quite make out in the low light. "Tell me about the night of the accident," she said. The shift in him was subtle but unmistakable. A stillness that went 1 degree colder, a stillness that, if she'd had any memory of danger to draw on, she might have recognized as the specific quiet of a predator deciding whether to strike or retreat. "You were driving back from a dinner," he said carefully. "A business dinner. The roads were wet. Another car ran a light and hit you broadside. That's all the police report says." "Was I alone?" "You were alone in the car, yes." Something in the precision of his phrasing, "alone in the car," snagged against Elena's instincts like fabric catching on a nail, though she couldn't yet articulate why. She filed it away, the way she was learning to file away all the small inconsistencies gathering at the edges of Dante Moretti's careful narrative. "I dreamed about rain tonight," she said instead, watching his face. "And your voice, shouting my name." Something flickered, grief, guilt, she couldn't tell which, before he mastered it back into stillness. "I was there, at the hospital within the hour. Someone must have called me the moment it happened." "Who called you?" "Elena." His voice had gone rough at the edges, unravelling slightly from its usual composure. "It's late. You should rest. The doctor said pushing the memories too hard can be counterproductive." It was, she would realise much later, the first time he'd used her medical condition as a shield rather than a genuine concern. And she let it work that night, because she was tired, and because some fragile new trust was beginning to root itself in her despite every rational reason for caution, and because the way he looked at her across that lamplit desk, grey eyes dark with something that looked almost like love and almost like guilt in equal terrible measure, made her want desperately to believe every word he told her. She didn't yet know that wanting to believe a lie is the most dangerous weakness a heart can have. 2 weeks after she woke, Dante took her to Onyx. It was, he explained on the drive over, a nightclub the family owned, one of several legitimate businesses that operated as both genuine revenue and something else, something he described only as a place where certain conversations happen more comfortably than in an office. Elena, dressed in a black gown Carmela had produced from her own former wardrobe, felt the strange vertigo of stepping into a life that fit her body perfectly and her memory not at all. The club itself was a cathedral of dark glamour, black marble, gold filigree, a live jazz trio on a raised stage, waitstaff moving through crowds of the wealthy and the watchful with practiced silence. Every head turned as Dante led her through the room, his hand at the small of her back, and Elena understood, viscerally, for the first time, the full weight of what it meant to be Dante Moretti's woman. Deference rippled ahead of them like a tide pulling back before a wave. They'd barely reached the private booth reserved for them when a woman intercepted their path. Stunning, dark-haired, wearing red silk that clung like water, her smile aimed at Dante with the particular confidence of someone who considered herself owed something. "Dante," her voice was honeyed, intimate. "I heard about the accident. I've been so worried." Her eyes flicked to Elena with a thin, assessing smile. "And this must be Elena. Still don't remember any of us, darling?" "This is Vittoria," Dante said, his voice gone flat and cool in a way Elena was learning to recognize as deliberate distance. "An old family friend." "Old friend undersells it," Vittoria said, laughing lightly, resting a manicured hand on Dante's forearm a beat too long. "We were nearly engaged ourselves once, before you swept in." This last aimed directly at Elena, sweetly poisoned. Something hot and unfamiliar flared in Elena's chest. She didn't have the memory to know if it was jealousy exactly, but it was something, sharp and territorial, entirely disproportionate to a woman she'd met 30 seconds ago, touching a man whose ring she didn't even wear. She watched Dante's hand move, unhurried but absolute, lifting Vittoria's fingers off his arm and setting them back at her own side. "That was a long time ago, and it was never what you're implying," Dante said, quiet and final. "Elena is my fiancé. She's carrying my child. I'd appreciate you remembering both facts." Vittoria's smile thinned but held. "Of course. Congratulations." She melted back into the crowd, but not before her eyes cut once more to Elena. Not jealous exactly, Elena would realize later, replaying the moment. Calculating. As if reassessing an obstacle rather than mourning a loss. "Are you all right?" Dante asked, once they were seated, his grey eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her pulse stutter. "I don't like her," Elena said, surprising herself with the bluntness of it. Something almost like amusement warmed his mouth. "Good instincts. You never liked her much either, even before." He reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing slow, absent circles over her knuckles, a gesture so tender it seemed to belong to an entirely different man than the one who'd just dismantled Vittoria's advance with surgical precision. "You don't have to worry about her, Elena. There's no version of my life where she matters more to me than you do." "How can you be so sure?" Elena asked quietly, "when I don't even remember what more feels like with you?" His thumb stilled against her skin. For a long moment, the noise of the club, the trumpet's low wail, the murmur of 100 conversations, the clink of glass, seemed to recede entirely, leaving only the two of them and the terrible honesty of the question. "I'm not sure of anything," Dante admitted, low. "I'm terrified every single day that you'll remember something that makes you hate me. But I know what I feel when I look at you, Elena, memory or not. That part hasn't changed. That part never will." She didn't know, yet, what exactly he was afraid she'd remember. But something in the rawness of his voice, in the fear flickering behind his usual stillness, told her it mattered. That somewhere in the locked vault of her missing memories waited a truth dangerous enough to frighten even a man who frightened everyone else in the room. 3 days later, A man Elena had never seen walked into Dante's penthouse without an appointment, and the entire household changed temperature. She was in the kitchen with Carmela when she heard the elevator chime, an unscheduled arrival which apparently never happened, and Carmela's face went the particular pale of someone recalculating an entire day's plans. By the time Elena reached the living room, Dante was already standing, positioned with his body angled slightly in front of hers, a stance she recognized even without memory as instinctively protective. The visitor was perhaps 50, silver-templed, dressed in a cream suit that whispered old money rather than shouted it. He moved with unhurried confidence through Dante's home as if he owned equal claim to the marble floors. "Vittorio," Dante said, his voice carrying none of its usual careful warmth, gone entirely to ice. "You didn't call." "Some conversations are better had in person, Dante. You know that." Vittorio's eyes slid past him, finding Elena, and something in his gaze made the fine hairs on her arms rise. Not lust, not quite, but an assessment so cold and proprietary it felt like being appraised for sale. "Elena, you're looking well. Better than I expected, given what you've been through." "Do I know you?" Elena asked, though something in her chest already suspected, dreaded the answer. "Vittorio Caruso," Dante said before the man could answer himself, "head of the Caruso family. Our two families have business arrangements." "We're practically kin," Vittorio said, smiling in a way that had no warmth in it whatsoever, "given the circumstances." "What circumstances?" Elena's voice sharpened, some instinct telling her she'd stumbled onto exactly the kind of buried truth she'd been circling for weeks. Dante's jaw was a hard line. "Vittorio, whatever you came to discuss, we can do it in my study. Elena doesn't need—" "Elena is carrying the future of both our families," Vittorio interrupted smoothly, and the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I think she has every right to know what she's carrying, Dante. Don't you?" "Get out." Dante's voice had gone very quiet, which Elena was already beginning to understand was far more dangerous than shouting. "Now!" Vittorio held up both hands in mock surrender, though his smile never faltered. "I'll go. But the negotiation clock is still running, Dante. The Ricci-Caruso alliance isn't going to wait forever for your amnesiac bride to remember her role in it." His eyes cut to Elena one last time, almost gentle, almost cruel. "Ask him about the night of your accident, cara. Ask him whose party you were really leaving when you got in that car." He left the way he'd come, unhurried, the elevator doors closing on his cream-suited silhouette, like a curtain falling on the first act of a play Elena hadn't known she was starring in. The silence after he left stretched unbearably. Elena turned to Dante, her whole body trembling with something between fury and terror. "What did he mean?" her voice cracked. "Ricci-Caruso alliance. What alliance? Why did he say, 'I have a role in it'? Dante, tell me the truth, right now." Dante's composure, so carefully maintained through weeks of careful half-truths, finally began to crack at the seams. She watched it happen, watched the cold, contained Mafia king dissolve, for one unguarded moment, into something that looked almost like a man drowning. "Elena, tell me." "Not like this." His voice broke on the words, raw in a way she'd never heard from him. "Not with him having just poisoned the room. Please, Give me until tonight. I'll tell you everything, I swear it, but I need you to hear it from me, not fed to you in pieces by a man who wants to use you against me. Use me how? Her hands had drifted unconsciously to her stomach, as if some animal part of her already understood, even without the memory to confirm it, that the answer involved the child she carried. Dante, am I in danger? The look on his face, fierce, tormented, utterly without its usual armour, answered the question before his words did. Not while I'm breathing, he said. I promise you that much, whatever else I've failed to tell you. No one touches you, no one touches our child. I would burn every family in this city to the ground before I let that happen. It should have frightened her. Some rational corner of her mind understood that a man who spoke so easily of burning families to the ground was not a safe harbour to shelter in. But standing there in the wreckage of Vittorio's visit, watching Dante Moretti's carefully constructed mask crack open to reveal the raw, desperate devotion underneath, Elena felt something in her own chest answer his ferocity with a matching, terrifying certainty. Whatever truth waited for her that night, she already knew, somehow, that she wasn't going to run from this man. She was going to fall the rest of the way in love with him first. He told her that night, in the study, with the lamp burning low and 2 untouched glasses of wine sweating rings onto the desk between them. My father and Salvatore Ricci, your father, Elena, were partners for 20 years, Dante began, his voice steady with the particular control of a man who'd rehearsed this confession 100 times in his head and was determined to get through it without breaking. Real estate, shipping. Half of what I inherited exists because of that partnership. But 6 years ago, when my father died and I took over, the Caruso family, Vittorio's family, tried to move in on our territory. It nearly started a war that would have destroyed 3 families and half the port district with it. I don't understand what this has to do with me, Elena said, though the cold dread pooling in her stomach suggested she was beginning to. Your father proposed a solution, Dante continued, an alliance between the Ricci and Moretti families, sealed by marriage, would give us the combined strength to push Caruso back without bloodshed. You were 24. I was 30. Neither of us had asked for it, but neither of us fought it either. It made sense, strategically, and He hesitated. I'd met you twice at your father's dinners. I already found you extraordinary before there was ever a contract involved. A contract? Elena's voice had gone very quiet. You're telling me our engagement was arranged? Business? It started that way, Dante admitted, and the honesty of it seemed to cost him physically, his hands flexing against the desk. But, Elena, it stopped being business for me within months. I fell in love with you, for real. I know that sounds like exactly the thing a man in my position would say to make a lie easier to swallow, but I swear to you, on my father's grave, it's the truth. And the pregnancy? Her hand had found her stomach again, protective, frightened. Was that arranged too? Something in his face went to war with itself before he answered. The Caruso family found out about our engagement and tried to counter it. Vittorio offered his own daughter to my cousin, tried to fracture the alliance from the inside. Your father insisted a pregnancy would make the union unbreakable. undeniable proof in the eyes of every family in the underworld that the Ricci and Moretti bloodlines were now one. He met her eyes, and the shame in them was raw, unguarded. "I want you to understand. I never touched you because of a contract, Elena. I wanted you. I would have wanted you if there'd been no alliance on earth. But I won't pretend the timing was entirely innocent either. Your father pushed for it. I didn't fight him, because by then I would have done almost anything to make sure you stayed mine." The word mine landed strangely. Possessive, ancient, the kind of claim men made in stories about kings and their queens, rather than modern penthouses and modern women. And yet some traitorous, memoryless part of Elena's heart didn't recoil from it. It ached instead with something like recognition. "The accident," she said. "Tell me about the accident. All of it. No more editing." Dante's jaw tightened. "You were leaving a dinner at the Caruso estate, a negotiation dinner, final terms for the alliance, formalizing everything before the wedding. Vittorio's men followed your car afterward. The police report calls it a random collision. It wasn't random, Elena. I believe Vittorio orchestrated it, a warning, or worse, an attempt to eliminate the alliance's guarantee before it could be finalized." His voice had gone rough, furious, grief-stricken all at once. "I nearly lost you both. The baby. You. I sat in that hospital hallway for 6 hours not knowing if you'd wake up. And when the doctors told me you might not remember anything, might not remember me, I made a choice, Eleanor. I decided I would rather have you love a version of me, built on comfortable lies, than lose you to the truth before you'd had the chance to fall for me all over again." Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything finally spoken aloud. Eleanor sat very still, feeling the shape of her own erased life settle into place around her, like a dress finally fitted to her body, ill-fitting in places, beautiful in others, undeniably, terribly hers. "You lied to me," she said finally, "to protect a lie you were already living before the accident even happened." "Yes, and you'd do it again." Dante didn't flinch from the question, didn't reach for an easier answer. "Yes," he said, "because losing you to the truth felt like a smaller tragedy than losing you to a bullet meant for our child. I know that doesn't make it right. I know I don't deserve the benefit of the doubt after everything I've hidden from you. But I needed you alive and safe long enough to tell you the truth myself, on my own terms, rather than have Vittorio weaponize it first." Elena looked at him for a long time, this cold, ruthless, devastatingly honest man who had built an empire on violence and somehow still managed to look at her like she was the only fragile, precious thing he'd ever been trusted to protect, and found, to her own quiet horror, that she believed him completely. She didn't leave that night, though some part of her, the part still angry, still reeling from the scope of what had been hidden from her, considered it. Instead, she asked Dante for space, and he gave it without argument, retreating to a guest suite on the floor below, leaving her alone with the ruins and remnants of a life she was only now beginning to properly excavate. Sleep didn't come easily. She lay in the dark, hands folded over her stomach, talking quietly to the small, unseen life curled inside her. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "Everyone around your father has a reason to lie to me. Everyone wants something from us." A pause, her voice catching. "But he looked at me tonight like I was the only true thing he owned. And I don't know how to hate a man who looks at me like that, even when I have every reason to." In the morning, she found her old sketchbooks again and spent hours at the writing desk by the window, letting her hands remember what her mind couldn't. The architecture of facades, the geometry of light through glass. It was, she realized, the first time since waking in the hospital that she'd felt something like herself, rather than a stranger wearing her own skin. Dante found her there at noon, hovering uncertainly in the doorway, like a man unused to asking permission for anything, which, she was learning, he mostly wasn't. "I brought you something," he said, holding out a small velvet box. Elena's whole body tensed. "If that's a ring—" "It's the ring you already own," he said quickly. "The one you were wearing the night of the accident. The hospital kept it in your personal effects." "I have had it in the safe. I thought—" He hesitated, uncharacteristically unsure. "I thought you should decide whether to wear it again. Not because I'm asking you to forgive everything overnight, just because it's yours, and you should have the choice." She opened the box. Inside sat a stunning emerald-cut diamond, the band an intricate lattice of smaller stones, beautiful, clearly expensive, and utterly unfamiliar to her eye, and yet, when she lifted it and slid it onto her own finger, it fit with an exactness that startled her, as if her hand remembered even when her mind refused to. "Why does it fit so perfectly?" she murmured, "when nothing else about this life fits at all?" "Because some things are true, whether or not you remember choosing them," Dante said quietly, and something in the simplicity of the statement undid her more than any grand declaration could have. "I need you to understand something," Elena said, looking up at him, the ring cool and strange and somehow right on her hand. "I'm not forgiving you. Not yet. What you did, building a relationship with me on a lie, even after the accident, even to protect me, that's going to take time to sit right in my chest, if it ever does. But I also can't pretend I don't feel something for you. Something that isn't memory, isn't contract, isn't obligation. Something that feels like it belongs entirely to this version of me, the one who woke up in that hospital with nothing but instinct to guide her." She took a breath. "So here's what I need. No more edited truths. No more protecting me from things I have a right to know, even if the truth is ugly, even if it implicates you. Can you do that?" Dante crossed the room and knelt, unexpectedly, in front of her chair, taking her hand, the one wearing the ring, in both of his grey eyes burning with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I can do that," he said. "I should have done it from the beginning. I let my fear of losing you convince me that control was the same thing as love. It isn't. I know that now." His thumb traced over her knuckles, over the ring. "Whatever you decide about us, whether you stay because you love the man I am now, or leave because you can't forgive the man who lied to protect you, I will tell you every truth you ask for from this moment forward. That's my promise to you, Elena. Not as your fiancé, as the father of your child, and as a man who has never wanted anything the way he wants your trust." Elena studied his face, searching, she realized, not for deception this time, but for the courage to believe that a man capable of such ruthlessness in his business could also be capable of this kind of raw, unguarded devotion in his heart. "Okay," she said softly. "Then tell me what Vittorio Caruso actually wants. Not the version that keeps me comfortable, the real one." Something in Dante's face tightened, dread perhaps at what honesty would cost him now that he'd promised to give it freely, but he nodded and began, finally, to tell her everything. "Vittorio doesn't want an alliance," Dante said, settling into the chair across from her, his voice low and measured in the particular way of a man forcing himself to stay calm while discussing something that enraged him. "He wants control. His family has always resented that the Ricci and Moretti dynasties controlled the Port District, while Caruso interests were relegated to the periphery. Smaller operations, less territory, less say in how the whole underworld economy of this city runs. When your father proposed the alliance between our families, Vittorio saw an opportunity." "What kind of opportunity?" "He offered his own son, Matteo, as an alternative match for you," Dante said. "Your father refused. The Moretti-Ricci alliance was already agreed, the terms were set. But refusing Vittorio directly was its own kind of insult in our world. He doesn't forgive insults. He collects them and waits for the moment they're most useful to spend." "And the accident?" I know, though I can't yet prove it in a way that would satisfy a court, not that courts matter much in our world, that Vittorio's men forced your car off the road that night," Dante said, his jaw a hard line. "Not to kill you outright. If he'd wanted you dead, you would be dead. Vittorio's methods are precise when precision serves him. I think it was meant as a message, a demonstration that he could reach you, reach the alliance's foundation whenever he chose. A warning before whatever move he's planning next." Elena's hand had gone once again protectively to her stomach, a gesture she was noticing she made more and more, as if her body had appointed itself guardian of the one certainty in all of this uncertainty. "And now? What does he want now?" "Now he wants leverage," Dante said. "Your memory loss has created an opening he didn't expect. A version of you who doesn't yet fully understand the stakes of the world you married into, who might, if approached carefully, be convinced that leaving me would be safer than staying." His eyes found hers, dark with warning. "That's why he came here. Not to threaten you outright. That would be clumsy, and Vittorio is not a clumsy man. He came to plant a seed of doubt, to make you distrust me enough that you'd be more receptive the next time he approaches, gentler, offering you an alternative path, perhaps even offering to help you disappear with the child, away from all of this." "Would that be safer?" Elena asked quietly, testing the question even as it made her stomach twist with something like grief at the thought. "If I took the baby and left the alliance, left the danger, would we actually be safer? Or would Vittorio just find us anyway?" Dante's face did something complicated, pain and a fierce protective anger that wasn't directed at her, but at the impossible bind she'd just accurately identified. "Vittorio would never let you simply disappear," he said honestly, "not with a Moretti heir in your belly. You would become a liability the moment you left my protection, a loose end that threatens the very leverage he's trying to build. The truth, Eleanor, as much as it costs me to admit it, is that the safest place for you and our child right now is here, beside me, where I have the resources and the men to protect you both. I know that sounds like exactly what a controlling man would say to keep you close, but it also happens to be true." Elena absorbed this in silence, feeling the walls of her new life close in around her. Not the walls of a prison, exactly, but the walls of a fortress she hadn't chosen to be born into, built by men fighting for power she'd never asked to be a pawn in. "There has to be another way," she said finally. "Some way out of this that doesn't involve me being a hostage to either family's ambitions." "There might be," Dante said slowly, something calculating entering his gaze. The mind of the man who ran an empire finally engaging with the problem rather than merely protecting her from its weight. "If I could prove definitively that Vittorio orchestrated the accident, evidence solid enough to bring before the other families, the ones who still hold sway over how disputes like this are settled, I could break his standing entirely. Strip him of the leverage he's trying to build before he can use it. It would mean war in the short term, but it would also mean, eventually, peace on our terms rather than his. And if you can't prove it?" Dante's silence answered the question more honestly than words could have. "Then we live like this," he said finally, quiet and grim, "for as long as it takes. Guarded, careful, together." His eyes found hers, steady despite the darkness of what he'd just described. "I know it isn't the life you would have chosen, Elena, if you'd been given a real choice from the start. But I promise you this, whatever comes, I will spend every resource I have, every year I have left, making sure it's a life you can still find some happiness in, even now, even like this." Elena looked down at the ring on her hand, then up at the man who'd given it to her. Not for the first time, she understood now, but for the second, the memory of the first proposal buried somewhere in the wreckage of her mind, waiting, perhaps, to return. "Then let's find that proof," she said. "Whatever it takes." The weeks that followed shifted something fundamental between them. Where Dante had once retreated behind careful walls of composed distance, he began, slowly, to let her see the man underneath, the one who read to their unborn child at night in low, uncertain Italian, because he'd read somewhere that infants recognized voices even in the womb. The one who cancelled a 9-figure shipping deal without hesitation the moment he learned it would require him to travel and leave Elena unguarded for 3 days. The one who, catching her studying her own sketchbooks late one evening, quietly commissioned an entire drafting table and set of professional tools without being asked, simply because he'd noticed the light in her eyes when her hands moved across old architectural plans. "You didn't have to do this," Elena said, running her fingers over the smooth new drafting surface, genuinely moved. "I know," Dante said, standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, looking, for once, almost boyish in his uncertainty. "I wanted to. There's a difference between what you need and what you deserve, Elena, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you get both." She was beginning to understand, in these unguarded moments, the particular tragedy of Dante Moretti, a man raised from childhood to believe that vulnerability was a weapon his enemies would use against him, who had built himself into something hard and untouchable because his father's world had demanded nothing less, and who now found himself, for the first time, wanting desperately to be soft for someone, and not knowing quite how. "Tell me about your mother," she said one evening, the two of them tangled together on the living room sofa, the city lights spread beneath them like scattered stars fallen to earth. Something flickered across his face, old grief, carefully filed away. She died when I was 9. Cancer. My father never remarried, never really recovered, though he hid it well behind the business. A pause. She used to sing to me in Sicilian. Old songs about the sea. I don't remember the words anymore. Just the shape of her voice. I'm sorry, Elena said softly, reaching for his hand. Don't be. It was a long time ago. But his fingers tightened around hers anyway, seeking the same comfort his voice refused to ask for outright. I think that's part of why I fell for you the way I did, even before the alliance made it convenient. You have her way of looking at people, like you're actually seeing them, not just what they can do for you. My whole life has been men looking at me and calculating my usefulness. You looked at me, that first dinner at your father's house, like you were curious about who I actually was underneath the name. He turned to face her fully, his grey eyes uncharacteristically open. I don't think I'd ever been looked at like that before. I think I fell in love with you for that alone, before anything else had the chance to matter. Elena felt something in her chest loosen at the confession. Not memory returning, not yet, but something adjacent to it. A recognition of character, if not of specific moments. The sense of falling in love with the same man twice over from 2 different starting points and arriving, somehow, at the same devastating conclusion. I think I'm falling for you again, she admitted, quiet and a little frightened by her own honesty. Not the memory of you, just you, now, as you actually are, stripped of the version I apparently loved before I forgot everything. Dante's hand came up to cradle her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with a tenderness that seemed at direct odds with the ruthless efficiency she'd witnessed him wield against Vittorio and every other threat that had crossed their path. Then let me be worthy of being fallen for twice, he murmured, and when he kissed her, slow, careful, asking rather than taking, Elena felt something settle deep in her chest that no fragment of returning memory could have given her. The simple, undeniable certainty that whatever had happened before the accident, whatever contracts and alliances had first drawn them together, what existed between them now was hers alone to claim, unmanufactured, unedited, entirely, terrifyingly real. They didn't rush anything further that night. He held her instead, one hand resting protectively over the small curve of her stomach, and murmured something in Sicilian she didn't understand, but felt, somehow, in the marrow of her bones. An old song, perhaps, imperfectly remembered, offered to the child they'd made together as the first inheritance he had left to give, that wasn't built on violence or power, but simply, quietly, on love. The attack came on a Tuesday, ordinary in every way, until it wasn't. Elena had insisted on visiting her old architecture firm, a small errand, escorted by 2 of Dante's men, meant to retrieve personal belongings from her old desk, in the hope that familiar objects might jar loose more fragments of memory. The visit itself was uneventful. It was the drive back, 3 blocks from the penthouse, when a black SUV forced its way alongside their car, and a man leaned out with a weapon that made Elena's whole body lock in primal terror. "Down!" Marco, Dante's head of security, shoved her low across the seat with one arm, while drawing his own weapon with the other, shouting something into a radio even as the driver swerved hard, tires screaming. Gunfire cracked against the reinforced side panel. The car, Elena would learn later, had been armoured specifically at Dante's insistence weeks earlier, a precaution she hadn't questioned at the time, and now understood with visceral gratitude, had likely saved both her life and her child's. The driver executed a series of violent manoeuvres, cutting through traffic, running 2 red lights, until the pursuing SUV finally peeled away, unwilling to press the attempt further in broad daylight, with witnesses multiplying by the second. By the time they reached the penthouse, Elena was shaking so hard she could barely stand, and Dante, who had been in a meeting 3 floors below the residence when Marco's emergency call came through, met the elevator already in motion, his face a mask of barely contained fury that transformed the instant he saw her into something closer to devastation. "Elena." He crossed the space between them in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, and she felt, for the first time, his hands actually trembling against her back. "Are you hurt?" "The baby, we're fine," she managed, though her voice broke on the words. "Dante, they had a gun. They just started shooting." I know, cara. I've got you." He held her, murmuring low reassurances in a mixture of English and Sicilian, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, the last vestige of doubt about the depth of his feeling for her, burning away entirely in the face of his raw, unguarded terror at nearly losing her. Later, once she'd been examined by the family's private physician and pronounced unharmed, once Dante had extracted a full account from Marco and dispatched 3 separate teams to trace the SUV's plates, he found her sitting rigid on the edge of their bed, arms wrapped tight around herself. "It was Vittorio," she said, not a question. "I don't know yet, definitively." Dante's jaw was iron. "But I have suspicions, and I intend to confirm them within the hour." He knelt in front of her, taking her hands, forcing his voice into something calmer than the murder currently occupying his eyes. "Elena, listen to me. This changes things. I'm doubling security, effective immediately. You don't leave this penthouse without at least 4 men, and that includes trips to the bathroom of a restaurant. I don't care how paranoid it sounds. I'm moving up the timeline on the evidence we've been gathering against Vittorio, and I'm calling a meeting with the other families tonight, before he has the chance to spin his own version of events first." "Dante." Her voice was small, frightened, in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be since the accident. "What if next time the armour isn't enough? What if next time there won't be a next time?" he said, and the absolute terrible certainty in his voice sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with fear of him and everything to do with fear for whoever had ordered the attack. "I built an empire out of nothing after my father died, Elena, by making it very clear to anyone who tested me that the cost of crossing me exceeded any possible reward. I let that reputation soften around you because I wanted you to know the man underneath the violence, not just the violence itself. But Vittorio just made the mistake of testing that softness against the wrong target. His grey eyes had gone flat, lethal, entirely unlike the tender man who'd murmured half-remembered lullabies against her hair only nights before. He came after you and our child. I promise you, on every drop of Moretti blood in my veins, he will regret that decision for whatever remains of his life." Elena should have been terrified by the transformation, the sudden, total absence of gentleness in a man she'd been falling in love with for weeks. Instead, watching him rise and begin issuing orders down the phone with cold, surgical precision, She felt something far more complicated: gratitude and desire, and the dawning understanding that the softness and the ruthlessness weren't opposing halves of Dante Moretti at all. They were the same devotion, wearing two different faces, both aimed entirely, unwaveringly, at protecting her. The meeting of families took place 2 nights later, in a private room at Onyx that had clearly hosted such gatherings many times before. No windows, reinforced walls, a long table surrounded by men whose names Elena didn't recognize, but whose bearing told her everything she needed to know about the power concentrated in that single room. She wasn't meant to attend. Dante had argued the point fiercely, worried about her safety, about the stress on the pregnancy. But Elena had insisted, standing her ground with a stubbornness that seemed to genuinely surprise him. "I'm the Alliance's guarantee," she'd said, echoing Vittorio's own poisonous phrase back at him with deliberate irony. "If they're going to discuss my life and my child's future, I have every right to be in the room when they do it." So she sat now at Dante's right hand, spine straight, hands folded over the small curve of her stomach, while the head of the Genovese family, an elderly man named Alberto with eyes like flint, laid out, in measured tones, the evidence Dante's people had gathered over the preceding weeks. Phone records connecting one of the SUV's registered owners to a shell company with ties to Caruso interests. A witness, a low-level Caruso soldier turned informant under promise of protection, who confirmed Vittorio had personally ordered surveillance on Elena's car in the weeks before the accident. Forensic analysis of the original crash scene suggesting the random collision had in fact involved a vehicle travelling at a speed and angle inconsistent with simple negligence. Vittorio Caruso, seated across the table with 2 of his own men flanking him, listened to the entire presentation with an expression of bored contempt that didn't waver until the informant's name was mentioned aloud. "This is theatre," Vittorio said finally, his voice dripping with practiced disdain. "Circumstantial nonsense, assembled by a man desperate to justify escalating a conflict he started by refusing my son a legitimate match. If anyone orchestrated tonight's little performance, Dante, it's you. Manufacturing evidence to seize territory you've long coveted." "Then explain the informant," Dante said, his voice deceptively calm, the calm of a blade held very still before the cut. "Explain why one of your own soldiers, under no duress from me, chose to confirm under oath that you personally ordered the vehicle that ran Elena off the road." "Men lie for money, Dante, or for fear," Vittorio said smoothly. "Yours has clearly been paid, or frightened into a story that serves your interests." It was at that moment Elena spoke, her voice cutting through the tension, with a clarity that surprised even herself. "I have a question," she said, and every eye at the table turned toward her. The first time, she suspected, that most of these men had heard the Alliance's guarantee speak with anything other than passive silence. "If none of this is true, Signor Caruso, then why did a man attempt to shoot into my car 3 days ago, in broad daylight, 4 blocks from where I now live? I don't remember most of my life before the accident, but I remember the sound of that gunfire perfectly well, and I remember whose family benefits most directly from removing me and my child from this equation." Vittorio's composure flickered. Barely, but Elena, watching for it as closely as everyone else in that room, caught it. "A tragic and unrelated incident," he said, recovering smoothly. The city is full of violence that has nothing to do with our family's business. Then you won't object, Alberto interjected, his flinty eyes fixed on Vittorio, with the particular patience of a man who had adjudicated 100 such disputes before, to a formal tribunal. Full accounting of both incidents, the accident and the attempted shooting, conducted under the old rules, evidence presented before the full council, judgment rendered accordingly. If you're innocent, Vittorio, you have nothing to fear from such a process. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Elena understood, before Vittorio spoke a single word in response, exactly how guilty he was. Because an innocent man, she was beginning to understand, about this world of careful power and careful violence, would have agreed instantly, loudly, gratefully. Vittorio Caruso instead took a long moment to calculate his response, and in that hesitation every man in the room read the truth as clearly as if he'd confessed outright. "I'll consider the council's request," Vittorio said finally, rising from his chair with as much dignity as he could muster under the collective, silent condemnation of the room. "But I'd remind everyone present that the Caruso family does not respond well to being cornered." His eyes found Elena's one final time before he turned to leave, and what she saw there chilled her more than any weapon had. Some debts, Dante, get collected, regardless of what any tribunal decides. He left, his men trailing behind him, and the room exhaled as one body once the door closed. But Elena, watching Dante's face carefully in the aftermath, understood that Vittorio's parting words hadn't been an empty threat. They'd been a promise. It was 3 days after the tribunal meeting was formally scheduled that Elena, searching for a spare set of house keys, stumbled instead onto something that would crack the last of her carefully rebuilt trust wide open. She'd gone looking in Dante's study, in the drawer beneath the wall safe where Carmela mentioned spare keys were sometimes kept, and found instead, beneath a stack of unrelated documents, a manila folder with her own name typed across the tab. E. Ritchie. Prenuptial Agreement. Original Draft. Her hands trembled as she opened it, some instinct warning her, before her mind had even processed the words on the page, that this was not a document meant for her eyes. Not yet. Not like this. The language was dense, legal, but certain phrases leapt out with brutal clarity. In the event that the union fails to produce an heir within 18 months of formalization, the Ritchie-Moretti alliance shall be considered void, and all territorial concessions shall revert to prior arrangement. And further down, in a clause that made her stomach drop entirely, should Elena Ricci be found unable or unwilling to fulfill the reproductive terms of this alliance, alternative candidates from the Ricci bloodline, including but not limited to cousin Isabella Ricci, may be substituted at the Moretti family's discretion. Substituted. As if she were a component in a machine, replaceable the moment she failed to perform her designated function. She was still sitting there, folder open on her lap, when Dante found her, his face draining of colour the instant he registered what she was holding. "Elena, that's an old draft. That language was struck before. Was I ever anything more than a clause to you?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt, cold in a way that seemed to frighten him more than any amount of screaming might have. "A reproductive term. A substitutable reproductive term, according to this. Tell me the truth, Dante. When did you actually fall in love with me? Or did you simply convince yourself you had, because the alternative was admitting you'd built an entire relationship on paperwork like this? That draft was written by lawyers before I'd ever properly courted you, Dante said, crossing the room quickly, kneeling in front of her chair with an urgency that bordered on desperation. I struck that clause myself, 6 months before the accident, the moment I realized I couldn't stomach the idea of you being replaceable to me in any sense. Elena, look at me. The final agreement, the one we both actually signed, has none of this language in it. I can show you. I kept this draft only because... He stopped, visibly searching for an honest answer rather than a convenient one. I kept it because it reminds me what I almost let this alliance turn you into, in my own mind, before I actually got to know you. It's a monument to my own failure, not a hidden clause I'm still operating under. Why didn't you tell me it existed? Elena's voice cracked, despite her efforts to keep it level. Why did I have to find this by accident instead of you simply telling me from the very beginning exactly how transactional this arrangement once was? Because I was ashamed, Dante said, and the admission seemed to cost him something visceral, his voice roughening with an honesty she'd rarely heard from him, even in their most unguarded moments. Because every time I tried to imagine explaining it, I heard exactly how it would sound. A man admitting he once viewed the woman he loves as an interchangeable clause in a business contract. And I couldn't bear watching that truth land on your face. So I told myself I was protecting you by staying silent, when really, I think I was protecting myself from having to watch you look at me the way you're looking at me right now. Elena studied him, kneeling before her, stripped of every carefully maintained defense, offering her the rawest possible version of his own failure, rather than another comfortable lie, and felt something complicated move through her chest. Fury, still, at the coldness of that discarded clause, at a world that had once considered her body a negotiable term rather than a person. But also, unmistakably, something like recognition of a man genuinely wrestling with the worst version of himself in real time, refusing, this time, to hide from it. I need to actually see the final agreement, she said finally. Tonight, every clause, no more discovering pieces of my own life by accident in a desk drawer. Anything, Dante said immediately. Everything. I should have shown you from the start. He retrieved the document within minutes, and true to his word, the language was entirely different. No substitution clause, no reproductive deadline, simply a straightforward union of two families with Elena named, repeatedly, not as a term of exchange, but as an equal party whose consent had been sought at every stage of the final drafting. It didn't erase the wound of what she'd found, but it began, slowly, the difficult work of showing her that the man kneeling in front of her had, at some point in the story neither of them fully remembered together, chosen to become someone worth trusting, even if the path there had been paved with exactly the kind of cold calculation she'd just uncovered evidence of. She left the next morning. Not far, only to Marissa's apartment across town, the friend who'd finally returned from her travels and arrived at the penthouse 2 days earlier, warm and familiar, in a way that jarred loose small, hazy fragments of memory Elena hadn't yet been able to place into any coherent order. But the distance mattered less than the act itself. For the first time since waking in that hospital bed, Elena needed space that didn't belong, in any sense, to Dante Moretti. You don't have to explain yourself to me, Marissa said, setting down 2 cups of tea in her small, sunlit kitchen, watching Elena with the particular patience of an old friend who understood grief didn't always need narration. "But if you want to talk, I'm here. I've known you for 8 years, Elena. I knew you before Dante Moretti existed in your life at all." "Tell me about me," Elena said quietly. "Not the version he's constructed for me these past weeks. I believe most of it now, honestly. I think he's told me the truth as best he understands it himself. But tell me who I was, the version that doesn't run through him at all." Marissa smiled, something wistful and fond crossing her face. "You were fierce," she said, "stubborn as hell. You turned down 2 other firms because you wanted creative control over your projects, even when the money was better elsewhere. You used to say buildings should tell the truth about what they were for. No false fronts, no decoration hiding structural lies. It used to drive your professors crazy in school. They wanted ornament. You wanted honesty." She paused. "You were terrified of the alliance at first. I remember you calling me the night your father told you about it, absolutely furious that he'd try to trade you like property." "What changed?" Elena asked, leaning forward. "What made me actually fall for him?" "Dante did," Marissa said simply. "You told me, maybe 2 months into it, that you'd expected a cold, calculating monster and found instead a man who listened to you talk about facades for an hour without once looking bored, who remembered every small preference you mentioned and quietly made sure they appeared in your life without ever announcing the gesture. You said," Marissa's voice softened, "you said falling for him felt like discovering an entire hidden flaw in a building you thought you already knew completely." Something in Elena's chest ached at the description, not because it contradicted what she'd learned of Dante over these past strange weeks, but because it confirmed it so precisely, offering proof from a source entirely independent of him that the man she'd been slowly, cautiously falling for now was, in fact, exactly the same man the pre-accident Elena had chosen with clear eyes and full memory. "He hid things from me," Elena said, "even after the accident, even when he'd promised to protect me with honesty instead of comfortable lies." "He's a man who was raised to believe control equals safety," Marissa said gently. "That doesn't excuse it, Elena, and only you get to decide how much of that pattern you're willing to keep forgiving. But for what it's worth, the version of you I knew before the accident chose to fight for this relationship, chose to push him toward honesty again and again, and told me more than once that the effort was worth it, because underneath all his careful control, you'd never once doubted that his love for you was real." Elena's phone buzzed against the table, a text from Dante, restrained and careful in a way that told her he was giving her exactly the space she'd asked for, no matter how much it must have been costing him, given the still unresolved threat from Vittorio. "No pressure. Just wanted you to know Marco is positioned outside Marissa's building for your safety, at a distance, out of sight. Stay as long as you need. I love you, and I'll be here when you're ready to come home, whenever that is." She read it twice, feeling something in her chest settle rather than tighten. The message of a man learning, in real time, the difference between controlling her and protecting her, between demanding her return and simply trusting she would choose it herself when she was ready. "I think I'm going to go back tonight," Elena said quietly. "Because you have to?" Marissa asked. "Or because you want to?" Elena considered the question seriously, turning it over against everything she'd learned in the past hour. The woman she'd been, the man she'd chosen, the frightening, unresolved danger still circling both their lives. "Because I want to," she said finally, and found to her own quiet relief that it was entirely true. "I'm still angry. I still have questions he needs to keep answering, for as long as it takes. But I don't want to build my life around running from him, Marissa. I want to build it standing beside him, eyes open this time, choosing it freely instead of just remembering having chosen it once before." It happened without warning, 3 nights later, triggered, the doctor would later explain, by the specific combination of rain against the window and the particular slant of headlights through wet glass, as Dante drove them home from a quiet dinner at a restaurant they'd apparently frequented before the accident. One moment Elena was reaching for the door handle, the next the world tilted sideways, and she was somewhere else entirely. Inside a memory, rather than merely hearing about one. Rain streaking the windshield, her own hands tight on the steering wheel, her phone propped against the dash on speaker, Dante's voice coming through tense and urgent. "Elena, where are you? The dinner ran long. I should have sent a car." "I'm fine, Dante. I'm 5 minutes from home. Stop worrying." A laugh in her own voice, warm, unafraid. Headlights in the rearview mirror, too close, too fast. "Someone's behind me. They're not—" The impact. Metal screaming. The phone flying from the dash. Dante's voice, tinny and distant, shouting her name over and over into a car that could no longer hear him. Elena gasped back into her body, into the present, finding herself in Dante's arms, half out of the car, his face inches from hers, white with panic. "Elena, Elena, can you hear me? Talk to me." "I remember," she gasped, her whole body shaking. "I remember the accident. I remember. Dante, I was on the phone with you. You knew something was wrong before it even happened. You heard it happen." His face crumpled, briefly, entirely, before he mastered it back into something steadier for her sake. "I heard everything," he said, voice raw. "The impact, your scream." Then silence for the longest 4 minutes of my entire life, until I got someone on the phone to confirm paramedics had reached you. He pressed his forehead to hers, breathing unsteadily. "I've relived that silence every night since. I thought, for those 4 minutes, I genuinely believed I'd lost you." More fragments followed over the coming days, arriving in no particular order. The proposal itself finally recovered in full. Not the sterile business arrangement she'd feared, but Dante on one knee in this very penthouse, hands actually trembling, voice cracking as he confessed he'd never expected to want anything as badly as he wanted a future with her, alliance or not. A memory of laughing with him in this kitchen, flour on both their hands, a disastrous attempt at making her grandmother's recipe from a memory of a recipe she'd never actually learned properly. A memory of the exact moment she'd learned she was pregnant. His face, transformed entirely by joy, so unguarded it had startled her. A man who apparently kept his emotions locked so carefully that even genuine happiness seemed to surprise his own features when it broke through. And then, finally, the memory that mattered most. The negotiation dinner itself, the night of the accident, recovered in its entirety. Vittorio Caruso, across an elegant table, all false warmth. "A toast," he'd said, raising his glass, "to the newest guarantee of peace between our families." His eyes had lingered on her stomach, already faintly visible beneath her dress, with an expression she'd dismissed at the time as simple courtesy, but now recognized with the clarity of hindsight as something calculating and cold. And later, as she'd left, Vittorio's own son, Matteo, catching her arm at the door, murmuring low enough that only she could hear, "You should be careful on these roads at night, Elena. Rain makes everything so unpredictable." A warning delivered with a smile that she'd dismissed in the moment as awkward small talk, and now understood, retroactively, as a promise. "Matteo," Elena said aloud, the memory settling into place with sickening clarity. "Dante. It was Matteo who warned me right before I left. He told me to be careful on the roads. He knew." Dante went very still, his grey eyes sharpening into something lethal. "Say that again. Exactly what he said." Elena repeated it, watching Dante's face transform as the pieces of a puzzle he'd been assembling for weeks finally clicked into their final, damning position. "That's not circumstantial anymore," he said quietly, already reaching for his phone. "That's a direct admission of foreknowledge from Vittorio's own son, delivered to your face before the crash occurred." "Elena." He looked up at her, something fierce and grateful and furious all at once burning behind his eyes. "This is the proof we've been missing. This changes everything." The formal tribunal convened 4 nights later, in the same reinforced room at Onyx, with every family head from the previous meeting present once again. And this time, Elena's fully recovered testimony carried the weight of an eyewitness account rather than second-hand suspicion. She told them everything, her voice steady, despite the danger of speaking such words aloud in a room full of powerful, watchful men. Matteo's warning at the door, delivered with a smile that had chilled her even before she'd understood its meaning. Vittorio's own calculating glance at her pregnant stomach. The toast that had sounded, in retrospect, less like a blessing and more like a countdown. Vittorio, seated across the table, had gone progressively paler throughout her testimony, his usual composed contempt fraying at the edges as Alberto and the other family heads exchanged glances that promised his previous denials would no longer hold. "A memory recovered conveniently after weeks of amnesia," Vittorio said finally, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "How is the council meant to trust testimony assembled from fragments a doctor himself admits may be unreliable?" "Bring Matteo before this council," Dante said, his voice cold and absolute. "Let him deny, to our faces, that he warned Elena about the roads that night. Let him explain, if he can, why an innocent man's son would offer such a specific warning to a woman he had no reason to believe was in any danger, unless he already knew precisely what danger awaited her." Vittorio's silence, once again, spoke louder than any denial could have. It was Alberto who finally rendered the tribunal's verdict, his flinty old eyes fixed on Vittorio with the weight of decades of enforced order behind them. "The council finds sufficient evidence, physical, forensic, and now testimonial, to hold the Caruso family responsible for the attempted assassination of Elena Ricci and the endangerment of the Moretti Ricci heir." His voice hardened further. "Under the old rules, Vittorio, this constitutes a declaration of war against 2 allied families simultaneously. You understand what that means for your territory, your operations, and quite possibly your life." Vittorio's composure finally shattered entirely, fury and fear, both breaking through the careful mask he'd maintained for weeks. "This is a coordinated ambush," he snarled, rising from his chair. "Dante has been maneuvering to seize my territory since his father died, using this staged tribunal as cover for—" "Sit down, Vittorio," Alberto said, and something in the old man's quiet command carried more genuine authority than Vittorio's entire outburst. "You had your chance to answer honestly. You chose theatrics instead. The council's judgment stands." He turned to Dante. "You have the right to seek retribution proportional to the offence under old law. What is your intention?" Every eye in the room turned to Dante, and Elena watched him, this man who had once told her quite plainly that he would burn every family in the city to the ground before allowing harm to reach her, weigh the full, terrible scope of his power in that single, suspended moment. "I want Vittorio's territory ceded to a neutral council administrator for the next 5 years, under strict oversight, effectively ending his family's independent operations without requiring further bloodshed," Dante said finally, his voice steady despite the visible surprise rippling around the table. "I want Matteo permanently exiled from the city, forbidden from any involvement in family business going forward. And I want a formal, binding acknowledgement before this entire council that any further action against Elena, our child, or anyone under Moretti protection will be met with total and immediate retaliation, with no further tribunal required." "You're passing on blood justice," Vittorio said, incredulous, some of his old arrogance flickering back to life at the apparent leniency. "After everything you've just accused me of?" "I'm choosing the path that keeps my family safe without dragging this city into a war that would cost dozens of innocent lives on both sides," Dante said, his grey eyes flat and final. "Don't mistake mercy for weakness, Vittorio. I am entirely capable of choosing the other option instead, if you'd prefer it. But Elena taught me something these past months that I don't think you've ever learned in your entire miserable life. That real power isn't measured by how much blood you're willing to spill. It's measured by how much restraint you can afford to show once you've already won." The council's murmured approval settled the matter. Vittorio, stripped of options and support in equal measure, had no choice but to accept terms that effectively ended his family's independent power in the city without the further devastation of open war. He left the room a broken man, his empire dismantled not by violence, but by the very evidence his own family's arrogance had left scattered across the wreckage of Elena's stolen memories. And Elena, watching Dante rise from his own chair, watching every man in that room regard him now with something closer to awe than fear, understood finally the full measure of the man she'd chosen to love. Cold enough to dismantle an entire criminal dynasty with a single calculated ultimatum, and warm enough, underneath it all, to choose mercy over blood for the sake of the family they were building together. The city, over the following weeks, settled into an uneasy but genuine peace. Vittorio's territory transitioned under council oversight with minimal disruption. Matteo disappeared to some distant relatives' holdings in Argentina, never to trouble the Ricci-Moretti alliance again. Elena felt for the first time since waking in that hospital bed the particular relief of a threat genuinely resolved rather than merely managed. But peace, she was learning, didn't erase the work of actually rebuilding a relationship on honesty rather than convenient omission. And it was in the quiet aftermath of the tribunal, once the immediate danger had receded, that Elena and Dante finally had the space to address everything that still stood unresolved between them. "I need you to understand something," Elena said one evening, the two of them curled together on the balcony overlooking the harbour, the city lights soft and gold beneath a clear autumn sky. "I forgive you, genuinely, for the lies you told after the accident, for the version of honesty you kept rationing out to me in careful pieces, because you were terrified of losing me to the truth. I understand why you did it, even if I wish you'd trusted me, trusted us, enough to simply tell me everything from the start." "I know," Dante said quietly, his arm tightening around her. "I've thought about it endlessly these past weeks. I told myself I was protecting you, but really, I think I was protecting my own fear of watching you choose to leave once you understood the full weight of what loving me actually costs. That wasn't fair to you. You deserved a partner willing to risk losing you to honesty, rather than one determined to keep you through careful management of the truth." "I need you to promise me something," Elena said, turning to face him fully. "Not just about the past, about everything going forward. Our child is going to grow up in a world where you sometimes have to make impossible choices. I understand that now, better than I ever could have before all this. But I need to be your partner in those choices, Dante, not someone you protect by keeping in the dark. Can you promise me that?" Dante was quiet for a long moment, and Elena watched him weigh the promise with the same gravity he'd have given any binding contract with a rival family, because, she understood now, that was precisely what this was. The most important negotiation of his entire life, conducted not for territory or power, but for the kind of marriage he actually wanted to build. "I promise," he said finally, and something in the simple weight of the words carried more conviction than any grand declaration might have. "Full partnership, Elena. Every decision, every danger, every truth, no matter how much it costs me to say aloud. You've more than earned that, choosing to stay and fight for this even after everything I hid from you." "Good," Elena said, some of the tension in her chest finally genuinely releasing. "Then let's talk about the wedding." Something shifted in Dante's face, surprise, then a slow, unguarded joy that few people besides Elena had ever been permitted to witness. "You still want to marry me, even now with full memory of everything, choosing it with entirely clear eyes." "I chose you once before the accident, apparently with my whole heart," Elena said, smiling despite the ache still present beneath the joy, the ache of everything they'd both survived to reach this moment. "And I've chosen you again since waking up as essentially a stranger to my own life, learning to love you from nothing but instinct and evidence rather than memory. I think that makes the choice more real, not less, Dante. I'm not marrying you because of a contract my father arranged, or because of memories I'm only now piecing back together. I'm marrying you because I've now fallen in love with you twice, from two completely different starting points, and arrived at exactly the same answer both times." Dante's hand found her face, cradling it with a tenderness that had become, over these past months, entirely familiar and yet somehow still capable of stealing her breath. "Then let's give this council-approved, alliance-mandated, entirely real marriage the wedding it actually deserves," he murmured against her lips, before kissing her, slow and certain, the city's lights scattered around them, like witnesses to a promise finally, fully, freely made. Below them, the child, growing steadily beneath Elena's heart, shifted. The first flutter of movement she'd felt strongly enough to notice, and she gasped softly, guiding Dante's hand to the spot with a wonder that momentarily eclipsed even the weight of everything else they'd survived to reach this quiet, ordinary, extraordinary moment. "Did you feel that?" she whispered. Dante's face, in the golden light, dissolved into something entirely unguarded, wonder and terror, and a joy so raw it looked almost like grief. "I felt it," he said, voice rough. "God, Elena, I felt it." The piece, however, wasn't destined to remain entirely uncomplicated, because 3 weeks before the wedding, a woman Elena had never met arrived at the penthouse unannounced, and the mention of her name in the prenuptial draft came rushing back with sudden, uncomfortable relevance. "I'm Isabella Ricci," the woman said, standing in the foyer with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. She was younger than Elena, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, a cousin, Elena would learn, from a branch of the Ricci family that had remained distant from her own upbringing, the very woman named in the original, discarded contract as a potential substitute bride. "I heard about everything that happened. The accident, the amnesia, Vittorio's tribunal. I thought it was time we finally met properly." Dante's posture beside Elena had gone immediately guarded. "Isabella, this is unexpected." "Most useful things are," Isabella said, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Dante, despite whatever suspicion I can see forming behind your very expressive stillness. I'm here because my branch of the family believes it's time to formally introduce myself to the woman who's about to become my cousin's most powerful in-law." Her eyes moved to Elena, assessing, though not unkindly. "I understand there was language in an early draft of your contract naming me as a potential substitute should you have proven unable to fulfill certain obligations. I want you to know, Elena, that I never sought that position. I was horrified when my father mentioned it as a possibility, honestly. I have my own life, my own path. I'm not here to compete with you for anything." Eleanor studied her carefully, feeling the old wound of that discarded clause ache faintly even now. "Then why are you here?" "Because our family's history is more tangled than you probably realize, given your memory loss," Isabella said, settling into the offered seat with the particular grace of someone who'd been raised in rooms exactly like this one. "Your father and mine were closer than most people know, closer than business partners. There are things about your father's original motivations for this alliance that I think you deserve to understand, now that you're strong enough to hear them, and now that the immediate danger from Vittorio has passed." Something in Dante's expression sharpened. "What things?" Isabella hesitated, glancing briefly at Dante, before returning her attention fully to Elena. "Your father didn't propose this alliance purely out of strategic necessity, Elena. He proposed it because he'd watched Dante over several years of business dealings and believed him to be the one man in this entire underworld capable of actually loving you the way you deserved, not merely using you as a political asset. He told my father, in confidence before he passed, that he'd engineered the introduction specifically hoping the two of you would fall for each other, and used the alliance's practical necessity as cover for what was, in his heart, simply a father trying to find his daughter a genuinely good match in a world with very few of them available." Elena felt something in her chest crack open unexpectedly, a fresh grief for the father she still couldn't fully remember, layered now with a strange, unexpected tenderness at learning he'd engineered her entire fate not out of cold calculation alone, but out of love, disguised as strategy. Why didn't he ever tell me that himself? Elena asked, her voice unsteady. Because men like our fathers rarely learn to say the tender thing directly, Isabella said gently. They hide it inside contracts and alliances instead, because that's the only language of care they ever learned to speak fluently. She reached across, briefly squeezing Elena's hand. I wanted you to know, before your wedding, that whatever cold machinery brought the two of you together, there was real love buried underneath it from the very beginning. Your father's love for you, disguised as strategy. I think that matters, given everything you've had to reconstruct about your own life from scratch these past months. Later that night, once Isabella had departed and the penthouse had settled back into its familiar quiet, Elena found Dante on the balcony, staring out at the harbour with an expression she couldn't quite read. Are you all right? She asked, joining him at the railing. I keep thinking about your father, Dante admitted quietly. I always assumed he arranged this purely for strategic advantage. Learning he did it hoping we'd actually fall in love. He shook his head slowly. It changes how I understand everything that came before. Makes me wish I'd had the chance to properly thank him before he died, for seeing something in me that I wasn't always sure existed myself. Elena leaned into his side, feeling the steady warmth of him against the cool night air. I think, she said softly, he'd be glad to know it worked. Whatever cold machinery started it, Dante, we built something real underneath it. I think that's the only inheritance that would have actually mattered to him. The wedding took place on a clear October afternoon at the Moretti family's ancestral vineyard estate outside the city. The same estate, Elena had since learned, where the photograph of Dante and his father had been taken years before her own life had ever intersected with the Moretti name. The ceremony itself was smaller than the world of power and consequence surrounding it might have suggested. Close friends, immediate family, Marissa standing as maid of honor, with tears openly streaming down her face throughout the entire proceeding. Alberto and several other family heads present as witnesses to a union that had, in the end, secured a genuine peace far more durable than any contract's language could have guaranteed alone. Elena wore ivory silk, simple and unadorned in the way she'd apparently always preferred elegance, a preference Marissa had confirmed with a fond laugh, entirely consistent with the woman she'd been before the accident, and precisely the woman she'd remained after it, memory or not. The dress skimmed gently over the now undeniable curve of her stomach, 7 months along, the baby's movements strong and constant enough now that Elena sometimes caught Dante simply resting his hand there for long stretches, wonder evident on his face every single time. You look, Dante said, his voice rough with emotion as she reached him at the altar, beneath an arbor heavy with late-season grapes. Like every reason I've ever had for wanting to be a better man than the one my world raised me to become. That's a very good line for a man who claims he doesn't talk much, Eleanor said, smiling despite the tears gathering in her own eyes. I've had months of practice, Dante murmured, trying to find words worthy of you. The officiant, an old family friend rather than a formal priest, given the particular nature of the guests assembled, guided them through vows that Eleanor had helped write herself, deliberately avoiding the traditional language of ownership and obligation in favour of something that felt, to her, more honestly earned. "I choose you," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. Not because a contract arranged it, not because memory compelled it, but because I've now fallen in love with the same man twice, from two entirely different beginnings, and found him worth choosing both times. I choose the man who lied to protect me and then found the courage to tell me the truth instead. I choose the man who dismantled an empire's worth of danger with cold precision and then came home to read half-remembered lullabies to our unborn child. I choose all of you, Dante Moretti, the darkness and the tenderness both, because I've learned they were never actually separate things at all. Dante's composure, famously unshakable in boardrooms and tribunals alike, finally broke entirely at her words, his eyes bright with unhidden emotion as he took both her hands in his. "I choose you," he said, voice thick, knowing now what it cost to almost lose you, and knowing I would spend every resource, every year, every drop of blood in my body to make sure it never happens again. I choose the woman who woke up in a hospital with nothing but instinct to guide her, and still, somehow, chose to trust me back into her life. I choose the architect who sees the honest bones beneath every false front, including, especially, my own. Whatever this world demands of us going forward, Elena, I promise you'll never again face it without knowing every single truth I have to offer, however much it costs me to give it. When they kissed, sealed as husband and wife, before the assembled witnesses of two once warring worlds, now bound together in genuine peace, Elena felt something settle in her chest that no fragment of returning memory, no reconstructed evidence, no tribunal's judgment could have given her. The simple, complete certainty that whatever had brought them together, contract, danger, or coincidence, what existed between them now belonged entirely and only to the two of them, chosen freely, twice over, and forever afterward. The reception that followed stretched long into the golden evening, the vineyard glowing under strings of warm light, and at one point, watching Dante laugh, genuinely laugh, an unguarded sound she'd rarely heard from him, even in their most private moments, at some story Marco was telling about his early, terrified days managing security for a man with Dante's exacting standards, Elena felt the last lingering shadow of doubt finally, fully dissolve. Whatever had been arranged, whatever had been lied about, whatever danger had threatened to unmake them both, what remained, standing in that golden vineyard light, was simply, entirely, love. Their daughter was born on a snowy January morning, 6 weeks after the wedding, in a private wing of the same hospital where Elena had first woken to a life she couldn't remember. They named her Sophia, after Dante's mother, the woman whose half-remembered lullabies he'd once murmured, uncertain and tender, against Elena's hair in the earliest days of her recovery. Watching him hold their daughter for the first time, this cold, powerful, dangerous man, reduced to something entirely unguarded by 6 pounds of new, fragile life, Elena understood with sudden, complete clarity that every fear she'd once carried about the darkness in Dante Moretti had always been incomplete. Because the same ferocity that made him capable of dismantling an empire with a single ultimatum was, in this quiet hospital room, simply devotion, wearing its gentlest possible face. "She has your eyes," Elena murmured, watching Sophia's tiny fingers curl instinctively around her father's much larger one. God help her, Dante said, though his voice was rough with something closer to prayer than complaint. I hope she has your heart instead, your way of seeing straight through to the honest bones of things. He looked up at Elena, and the love in his expression was so complete it nearly undid her. Thank you, he said quietly, for choosing to stay, for choosing to trust me back, even after everything I got wrong, trying to protect you the wrong way. I don't think I properly understood, before you woke up in that hospital bed, a stranger to your own life, how much I needed you to choose me freely, rather than simply remember having done so once before. I'd choose you 100 times over, Elena said, settling carefully against his shoulder, watching their daughter's small chest rise and fall in peaceful sleep. Amnesia or not, contract or not, danger or not, I think some part of me always would have found my way back to you, Dante, whatever the universe threw at us to try to keep us apart. Outside the window, snow fell steadily over the city. The same skyline she'd first glimpsed from Dante's penthouse windows months earlier, disoriented and frightened and entirely unmoored from her own life. Now, holding their daughter between them, married to a man she'd fallen in love with twice over from two entirely different starting points, Elena felt, for the first time since waking into nothing, completely, unshakably found. The Caruso territory remained peacefully absorbed under council oversight. Vittorio, stripped of power and relevance, had retreated entirely from the city's underworld, an old man diminished by his own arrogance rather than by any final act of violence Dante had ultimately chosen to withhold. The alliance between the Ricci and Moretti families had achieved, in the end, exactly what Elena's father had always hoped for it, disguised beneath its cold, strategic architecture. Not merely territorial peace, but a genuine, hard-won love between the two people meant to seal it. Elena had returned gradually to her architectural work, smaller projects now, chosen carefully around the demands of new motherhood, but no less meaningful for their reduced scale. She'd designed, in fact, a small addition to the vineyard estate where they'd married, a nursery wing with floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the morning light exactly the way she'd always preferred in her pre-accident sketches, honest architecture built around the family they were becoming rather than the family that had once been merely arranged. "Do you ever wish," Dante asked her quietly, one evening months later, Sophia asleep in her crib nearby, "that none of it had happened the way it did? The accident, the amnesia, everything you had to relearn about your own life from nothing?" Elena considered the question seriously, turning it over with the same careful attention she gave to every structural problem in her work, weighing load and consequence and the honest truth beneath the surface. "No," she said finally. "I think I needed to fall in love with you twice, Dante. Once with full memory and full context, and once with nothing but instinct and evidence to guide me. I think it's the only way I could have ever been completely certain that what exists between us isn't habit or contract or memory alone. It's simply, entirely, who we actually are to each other, chosen freely both times." She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his, feeling the familiar weight of the ring on her own finger that had, against every rational expectation, fit her perfectly from the very first moment she'd slipped it on as a stranger to her own life. "Whatever cold machinery first brought us together, Dante, I think we built something real enough underneath it to survive losing every memory of how it started and finding our way back to each other anyway. Outside, the city lights spread beneath them like scattered stars fallen gently to earth, the same view that had once disoriented a woman waking into a life she couldn't remember, now simply, quietly, entirely home.